Chapter 14 of Stories in Grey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brandy Morgan. Stories in Grey by Barry Payne. Miniatures Part 1. The Remedy. The morning was fresh and cool, with a promise of great heat to come later. The street of the drowsy village was almost deserted. Nothing in it was very active except the butcher's cart, always more active than other carts. The children were at school. Old people stood at their doorways, waiting for a chance to tell a passer-by that the weather promised to be a scorcher. A neat little old lady came out of a neat little house at the top of the street, and across a neat little garden in front of it. It was all in keeping. Given the house, you could have constructed the woman. Given the woman, you could have constructed the garden. She paused at the gate to explain to her cat that he must not come with her. The cat was horribly bored and never had any intention of going with her. Then she went on her way with a slight smile on her timid, patient face and her leather handbag grasped firmly. The smile met with responsive smiles as she went along. Any of the people at the doorways would have told you who she was and that she did any amount of good. She spent more of her small income on others than on herself. She was free to nurse anyone who happened to be ill, an accommodating banker to anyone who happened to be poor. She had never been able to pass a child crying in the street without stopping to find out what was the matter and to put it right if possible. The curate, a pleasant-looking bronzed man, stopped for a brief chat with her. She was sure that there was not going to be any rain. She kept a bunch of seaweed and went by that. The talk turned to church work. "I suppose," said the curate, "you were out on your errands of mercy as usual." The old lady's face changed. For a moment there was a look of horror and of desperate resentment. "I can do nothing," she said. "In that way I have been at it so long, and it still goes on, suffering everywhere. To try to abate it is like trying to clear a desert by picking up the grains of sand. There is only one thing—" She broke off abruptly, opening her handbag and producing a box of sweetmeats. "You will have one of these?" she said earnestly. "Thanks very much," said the curate. "I never eat sweet things, and I mustn't rob your favourite children." As she passed on, he paused and looked after her. Really, she had been rather queer. At the end of the street she met a little girl crying and heard her story. The little girl had a very bad toothache, so bad that the teacher had allowed her to go home from school. "Yes, my dear," said the little old lady, "you will have that tooth out, and then another one will ache, and then another. It is the way the world was made. It goes on like that. But do take one of these." Again she produced her box. The child took one and thanked her. Once clear of the village, a tramp of great judgment saw that this was a suitable opportunity. He began a plain, manly statement that he had walked from Manchester and had not tasted food for 3 days, and that God knew he was willing to work if only he could find a job. The old lady gave him a shilling. "Yours is a very sad case, my man," she said, "and I have no delusions about it. The shilling will do you no real good. By tomorrow or next day you will be just as poor and just as hungry, unless— But won't you take one of these?" The tramp hesitated. Still, she had given him a shilling, and it would do no harm to humour her. He took a couple of sweetmeats from the box, thrust them into his large dirty mouth, and touched his cap. The old lady went on her way. Further on she found a woman, the mother of far too many children, who complained bitterly. The old lady heard her story to the end. "Yes," she said, "it is as you say. There is a great deal of suffering in the world. I am quite powerless to alleviate it, but I think you should take one of these." And again the box was produced from the handbag. On her way home the old lady passed the tramp again. He was lying under the hedge, and he was dead. She stood a moment looking at him without horror and with a mild interest, and then went back to the neat little house in the neat little garden. There she sat and waited for the police. They sent her to Broadmoor, of course. In the hospital garden. The little grey monkey sat up on the bough of the lebbek. handling meditatively the slender chain that limited his freedom. His wise, blinking eyes looked out toward the desert and saw the sand clouds dim in the distance. Soon undoubtedly, the Khamseen would be here, and the last of the tourists would go. The Khamseen, a hot, dust-laden wind, blows, so the Copts say, from their Easter until their Pentecost. It keeps its appointment with fair accuracy as a rule. But after all, tourists did not concern the monkey very much. One or two of them came now and again on a visit to Hakim Basha, and he had heard them in heated argument with superfluous guides in the road beyond the compound. But he was the hospital monkey, not one of those that earn their bread and their masters in front of hotel verandas at a loss of personal dignity, but the monkey of a small but scientific and also religious establishment. True, the little hospital had not the extent or the equipment of the great hospital of Kasr-el-Aini, but it was doing good work. It considered the soul as well as the body of the patient. The residential monkey at such a place has a position, and he deserved it. He never bit and he never scratched. He accepted the proffered nut with solemn civility. If he was somewhat of a philosopher, that may have been due to the fact that 2 or 3 conflicting religions, all in excellent working order, were going on under his very nose. And to the philosophy may be ascribed his habits of reserve. He did not come when he was called, unless it was to the soft cooing voice of the little blind girl. If any other would pet him or play with him, he retired gently up the tree, turned his back and thought deeply. He was well aware, too, that if you keep in the shade and move rapidly, the snapshot photograph of you will hardly repay development. He certainly had the air of knowing much. He would look over a group of natives as though he diagnosed which of the common plagues of Egypt brought them there. This one was eyes, and that one also was eyes. This was tubercular, and that would be treated with a dose of thymol that would startle a European practitioner. Perhaps he was not always accurate. The first day the pretty blind girl had called him from her seat on the turf under the lebbek tree. He had come to her at once, and had seen that it was her eyes which troubled her. But that was not all, nor was it the worst of the trouble. The grey monkey turned to the garden beneath him. There stretched the hedge of hibiscus, a glory of scarlet flames. Beyond, there glimmered faintly in the sun the creamy white of the oleander. On the seat below the lebbek tree snored a fat native woman, old and past at 35. But nowhere could be seen the pretty blind girl. And this was now the second day that she had not been in the garden, the second day that she had never called to him. He may be acquitted of low motives. It is true that she fed him, but their friendship dated from the day when she came in, and she had nothing to give then. She subjugated the hospital in a few hours. It may have been because she was so pretty, or because her cooing laugh was so musical, or because all her ways were charming, or because it was so sad that she had lost her sight and was like to lose her life as well. She became a general pet, and the monkey was her special pet. And she did not come to him empty-handed. The monkey blinked gravely. He could not think what had happened to her. The reader has guessed, of course. Inside the hospital all was over. It was the last chance, and it had failed. The doctor went on to other cases where his skill might be of better service. The hard-featured Englishwoman, who did the work of 3 and hated sentimentality, was compelled to be angry with herself. If she was going to be stupid, every time a little native girl died, of what use was she likely to be? As the evening came rapidly on, the monkey made up his mind on 2 points. Obviously his friend was quite well again. The doctor had given her back her sight, and she had gone home. The second conclusion was that the swivel of his chain could be negotiated. It was dusk when he negotiated it, and slipped through the tamarisk hedge over the wall to look for the blind girl. Among the mud huts, quick eyes saw him. He heard the scream of excited voices, and felt the shower of stones. He fell from the roof to the ground, and that ends his story. Nor may we suppose that he and his playfellow will meet again. The 2 or 3 religions that he daily contemplated are agreed upon that point. Reassurance. "Now then," said the man sternly when she had glanced through the letter. "I always knew this would happen one day," she said quietly. "Yes, he wrote it. He wrote others, and I destroyed them. It was careless of me to let this fall into your hands. Well, what will you do?" "I don't know," said the man. "I think I shall kill you." "That would be one way," she said drearily, tearing the letter in her hands into little pieces as she spoke. "Perhaps it would be the best way for me. Not for you, nor—" The man interrupted her. "I shan't kill you till I've wrung the truth out of you." "You would never believe the truth now if you heard it." "Tell it me." "The truth is that I love you." She dropped the little bits of torn letter, a few at a time, into the basket by her writing table. "Indeed?" the man sneered. "And that letter?" "Is it so hard to explain? Vanity at the age of 41 requires a little reassurance. The letter was a form of reassurance. I am 41, you know, even if I don't quite look it." "And you dare tell me that you love me?" He seemed less resolute. There had been sincerity in her voice and look as she spoke. "I do. I think there are just 2 people in the world for whom I would give my life. Mona is one, and you are the other. You and I have been married for 20 years, and romance does not live as long as that. We may as well admit that and not grumble at it. It's silly to grumble at the inevitable. But if ardent romance is gone, love has not. The rock is colder than the flame, but the rock endures. You are the father of my Mona. I nursed you when you were so ill. I've had pride in your success and been ever so sorry when you were disappointed. You do many things for me every day. We suit one another, and we don't quarrel. I know you so well, too. I often know just what you will say before you speak. I know you all by heart and in my heart. How could I help loving you? And you loved me too." "Until this, strangely enough, I believed that you loved me, although—" Yes. "Listen, please. I must go through with this. You say that what you have told me is true. Now I must know the rest of the truth. Tell me about this man. Tell me everything that—" He stopped abruptly as a servant entered the room with a telegram. His face changed as he read it. He said quietly that he would send the answer himself later. As the servant closed the door again and the woman sprang from her place, "It's bad news." "It's bad news," she said. "I know it. I read it in your face. It's Mona, isn't it?" "Yes. A serious accident. They want you to come at once." He glanced at the clock. "You will have just enough time to catch the 3:30. Be quick. I'll see about the carriage for you." She was soon ready. He found her standing before her dressing table, crying. "My Mona," she said. "She was to have come home for her birthday tomorrow. I'd be buying things for her. "Don't," he said gently. "Come now, please." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. "Are you coming too?" "Yes, I'm coming with you." She could not speak, but her lips made the word, "Thanks." One hand stole out and just touched his sleeve, lightly and shyly. A month later they were still away from home. During that month Mona had come very near to death and had turned backward to life again. She was near now to complete recovery. One day she told her mother that the really glorious thing was that the accident had not in any way injured her personal appearance. "You're quite beautiful," said her mother, "but you mustn't be vain. There's nothing more natural or more dangerous." "But why dangerous?" "Because when you grow to be an old woman like me—" "But you're not the least little bit old." "Listen, if you're vain when you grow to be an old woman, just exactly like me, you may want reassurance. You understand that?" "Not the least bit." "I didn't think you would." Mona laughed. That evening in the garden the woman found her husband and sat down by his side. "Mona's getting on splendidly," she said. "She will come down tomorrow." The man looked at her with kindly eyes. They had been through fire together, and he saw her heart as proved gold. He drew her to him and kissed her, and she sighed the happy sigh of a forgiven woman. Of that letter and its writer no word was ever spoken again by either of them. He asked for no confession, and she made none. The years passed on with placid happiness for them. The Lucky Woman. When they were respectively the ages of 18 and 19, it becomes necessary for the two Miss Venners to do something for themselves. They were orphans, and they divided between them the fortune of £50 a year. The elder and the plainer of the two, Ellen Venner, took her own strong line at once. She married a dissenting minister, and made for herself a little home at Brixton. The more vulgar of her acquaintances said that it was no great catch. Beatrice, the younger sister, was fortunate enough to obtain the post of governess to Mrs. Pauling's 3 dear little boys. Moreover, she had retained her post and won for herself some portion of the respect and goodwill of Mr. and Mrs. Pauling. The 3 dear little boys kicked her with almost unnecessary profusion, and learnt very little from her. But then boys will be boys, and if we are to be frank, it must be admitted that Beatrice Venner had very little to teach. She had good food. She had £30 a year over and above her private income. She had occasional holidays and 2 evening dresses, and in course of time still a further blessing was to befall her. The further blessing came when she had been with the Paulings for about 4 years, and it was beginning to be said by Papa and Mamma that the eldest of the dear little boys certainly ought to go to school now. As he was by far the hardest and most persistent kicker of the 3, Beatrice heard this without regret. A governess would still be wanted for the other 2. It was at this time that Mr. Pauling's old friend, Mr. Yardley, came to stay at the house. Mr. Yardley was a youth of about 45, by profession a stockbroker, unmarried, priding himself somewhat on gallant manner with the ladies. He was chubby, tubby, and clean-shaven. His hair was very thin on top of his head, and he took something for it. He had an income of £2,000 a year and the most commonplace mind in the city, and he enjoyed both of them thoroughly. He was a mind that would never make a fortune, or come to wreck. He was distinctly satisfied with himself. I do not know whether his friends and intimate relations had told him so, or whether he had found it all out for himself, but at the moment when he came on that visit to the Paulings, the decision was firm and hot within him that he must not lead this gay butterfly life any longer. He must settle down. His gallant but perfectly polite eye fell upon Beatrice Venner. In the drawing-room after dinner he inquired if she was fond of music, and added, as he always did, that he himself was devoted to it, though he was no performer. Pulled up somewhat short by Beatrice's frank confession that she did not care for music in the least, he added, with a reasonable desire to please, that he himself knew that there were other things, and that he could get along very well without it. The conversation passed to other topics. That day and the next day, and the next, it was quite obvious to Mrs. Pauling that Mr. Yardley was paying marked attention to the governess. There was no illegitimate secrecy about the man. That evening in the smoking-room he explained portentously to Mr. Pauling his decision to marry Mr. Pauling's governess. "Good heavens, you don't say so," said Mr. Pauling. "Well," he added, "she is a very good girl, and this will be a rare bit of luck for her." Beatrice Venner accepted the rare bit of luck with meekness and gratitude. It was true that she was not in the least in love with Mr. Yardley, but she admired his income and his other estimable qualities. Certainly, too, she was not in love with anybody else. She received many congratulations. The letter from her sister Ellen was of somewhat of a subacid character, implying that she did not expect that they would see much of Beatrice down at Brixton after this. She also added that conscientious scruples would not allow her husband and herself to be present at a wedding in a church. This did not prevent Beatrice from being married in a church in a beautiful white dress and a beautiful lace veil, with 2 bridesmaids, with the youngest Pauling boy as a page. with the voice that breathed o'er Eden, and generally speaking with pomp. She was quite happy in a placid way for some time after her marriage, and she did not drop her sister down at Brixton. Beatrice had no children, and her sister had many. Beatrice thought of adopting one of them. Her husband, kindly but firmly, thought not. She had been married 8 years, and the edge of the luxuries had worn off. Her remarkable luck had become quite commonplace, and she was beginning to find her husband a very slow man with a tendency to hypochondria. And one day she went to Brixton to her sister's squalid abode to play a game with her sister's new baby, which was a perfect beauty. She was late in returning and found that her husband had already got back from the city and was going round the gardens. It was springtime, and she found him standing in the orchard, his frock coat and his silk hat still on him, looking grotesquely out of place. He pointed out the fruit prospects with gravity, and with some knowledge of the subject. "It's a queer thing," he said, "that this one tree has no blossom on it at all." "I'm glad," she snapped furiously. He stared at her with his little eyes wide open. "No, I am not glad," she added quickly, and pressed her lips to the rough bark of the tree and kissed it. "My dear child," he said in gentle remonstrance, "have you gone quite mad?" "No," she said, "but I think I shall." Then she ran into the house, and he followed laboriously to inquire what she was crying about. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Stories in Grey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susanna Mason. Stories in Grey by Barry Payne. Miniatures Part 2. The Woman in the Road. Henderson drove slowly. There were several small carts in the road, driven in the indolent, unintelligent, rustic fashion, and little groups of villagers. All were going in the same direction, turning in at the gates of the drive. Henderson had seen the notices of the sale by auction displayed in the outer walls of the garden. Everything apparently was to be sold, and everything included a motor car. It might be worth while to look at it. Henderson wanted a more powerful car than the one he was driving, and there might be other things that he would like to buy. In any case, these auction sales were frequently amusing. A dealer came up to him as he stepped out of his car, and asked if he could execute any commissions. He took Henderson to see the big motor car. "Mr. Jasper only drove it about a month," said the dealer. "Why is it being sold?" "Everything is being sold. Mr. Jasper is bankrupt and in prison now." It was a modern, up-to-date 36 HP car, and Henderson went over it with an engineer's critical eye and could find no fault. When his prolonged examination was finished, he decided that if it went for 400 he would buy it. He believed that it would fetch much more, but at these country sales one never knew. He gave the dealer his instructions, and the dealer bought the car for him for 95. "Now then," said Henderson to the dealer, "tell me what's wrong." "There's nothing wrong that a sensible person would take any notice of. These villagers get ideas into their heads. Mr. Jasper wasn't liked even before that thing happened, and—" "Look here, what's this?" said Henderson. He unwound a few long black hairs that were entangled in the acetylene lamp. "Bless my soul!" exclaimed the dealer. "They must have come from the woman that he killed." "Ran a woman down in the road, did he? How was that?" "He was bad-tempered always, and that day he was drunk too. I suppose she didn't skip out of the road fast enough for him." "Why didn't you tell me all this before?" "I supposed you knew it. Everybody about here knows it. Why, it was because of what she said just before she died that no one would bid today. She said she knew she was going to die, but she was not done with the car yet. She was a gypsy, and some people think that gypsies can foretell things. It's all stuff and nonsense to my mind." "It's absolute stuff and nonsense. Why didn't you buy the car yourself? You might have made money on it." "Might or might not. It's not my line of business. I know nothing about motors, and I've got no capital to put into a thing like that." A few days later Henderson got his big car home. He was delighted with it. He liked to feel the great power under him, and to compare the pace at which he could take the steepest hills now with what he had been able to do on the smaller car. This smaller car he had sold for considerably more than he had paid at the auction, and on the whole he considered that it had been a very good day's work for him, and blessed the superstitions and prejudices of ignorant people. The rest of the story came out in the evidence which Henderson's driver, a Frenchman who spoke no English, gave at the inquest. The interpreter was asked more than once by the coroner if he was quite certain that he was giving the man's evidence correctly. The evidence was that Henderson was driving fast on a straight stretch of road with nothing in sight. There was a stone wall on his left. Suddenly Henderson gave a loud cry, pulled the wheel hard over to the left, and dashed into this wall. By some miracle the Frenchman was not injured in the least, and he did the best he could for his master, who lay unconscious. In a minute or two Henderson opened his eyes and spoke. He said, "Did we go over her?" The driver told him there had been nobody there. "Of course there was," said Henderson. "She jumped out suddenly in the middle of the road, right in front of the car. A swarthy sort of woman. Looked like a tramp." He tried to say more, but again became unconscious and died in a state of unconsciousness an hour later. 2 men. The murderer generally knows that he is a murderer. The vain man, who is from a social point of view, is frequently the greater sinner, never knows that he is vain, unless somebody tells him. Even then he must be told with considerable force, and the hypothesis that the teller is jealous must be too absurd to be tenable. Richard Perrell was convinced somewhat suddenly of vanity and his other defects by Rhoda Lestrange. The social manner may be only skin deep, but it is a tough skin. It takes more than a scratch to get through it. The natural Rhoda came through one night at a dance when Perrell made her angry without intending it. When a boy suddenly tears off the boxing gloves and wishes to continue with bare fists, there is generally somebody handy to stop him. But there happened to be nobody to stop Rhoda. I doubt if anybody could have stopped her. A moment before she had been smiling and saying the usual things, and before Perrell could grasp what the reason was, though she soon told him, she was being absolutely truthful, absolutely merciless, absolutely brutal. His first feelings were those that he would have had if a woman to whom he was talking had suddenly lost all control of herself through drink or madness. But those feelings changed later. He was swept out of momentary horror into lasting shame. He had been speaking of Lucy Willinger's engagement, which he professed to find incomprehensible. Rhoda was an intimate friend of Lucy's, and understood the engagement perfectly, but as she had no intention of telling Perrell anything about it, she said that she thought so too. Perrell suggested that pique might be the explanation. "In fact," he added fatuously, "I have heard it hinted, though it is ridiculous enough, that I am to blame." The social manner still held. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Did you advise her in any way?" "No, not that." Rhoda's eyes flashed. "Since you are so fond of explanations, I will tell you 1 or 2 things that you had better know. Things about yourself." "Delighted," said Perrell, who had not seen the eyes or grasped the situation. "For instance, I think you do not know that you are the common joke of the set that by no means for your sake still tolerates you. I have seen you leave people whom you evidently thought that your bragging had impressed mightily, and I have been sorry that you did not hear what was said when you had gone. I suppose you cannot help it. It is one of your natural disadvantages. It is one of many. You need not stare at me. I know perfectly well that I have lost my temper. I hope I shall lose my temper again if I ever again hear a cad lying about a woman to satisfy his silly vanity. It is not likely. One is generally careful not to meet your type. If a woman talks to you at dinner to satisfy conventions and her hostess, you think that she is in love with you. If you had not been as dense as a millstone, you might have seen how all women, and Miss Willinger particularly, worked and plotted to avoid your society. You shall hear presently what they say of you, of your appearance, your manners, your habit of drinking too much, your blunders, your brag, even your fancied accomplishments. You do not even know the nickname by which everyone calls you, but you shall know it. You are fond of explanations. Afterwards, even your vanity will not tempt you to say that Miss Willinger or anybody else was in love with you." Perrell had gone very white. "I can see that I have offended you, but I think that there is a misunderstanding. I did not say that Miss Willinger was in love with me. I even expressed my opinion that the idea was ridiculous." "You did not say it?" "No, because you thought it would impress me more if you said that others said it. And you did not mean me to think you ridiculous. You are amusing when you try to veil your brag. You always do it so clumsily. But I thought you would make some such spiritless excuse. Well, let me tell you some true stories, things you have done and things other people have said of you." That was where, he told himself afterwards, he should have left her. But he had a morbid desire now to know the very worst. For all the vainest men live on the edge of a precipice of self-abasement. She gave him chapter and verse, dryly and bitterly. She must have hated him for a long time, and made notes of things in her mind. The image of himself, as he had supposed himself, collapsed in fragments. Out of them arose a ghastly figure, himself as he was, and now knew that he was. For a moment he had a sense of injustice. He had said a silly thing from a kind of instinctive vanity, and without planning it consciously. But did it merit this virulent punishment? What did it matter? Socially he was done and finished. Rhoda Lestrange would cut him, and she would take good care not to be alone in her action. He found himself standing up, speechless. He got out somehow. After the last carriage had rolled away in the early morning, he was still awake. He sat and thought over the comparative values of suicide, the Catholic Church, active service, the life of a scholar and a recluse. Underneath them all was the idea that he had to get away from them, but primarily he had to get away from himself. A few months later he left England for New York. He returned 3 years afterwards, shy, quiet, unselfish, and wealthy. He then married Rhoda Lestrange. And if this seems curious, remember that vanity is a vice, with a cognate virtue, which is imagination, and that women and men have a tendency to admire their own work. The Enemy. From the letters of Lady Raffenstall, formerly Miss Hilda Branton. First extract. Bearing an address at Littlehampton. You must, of course, write and let me know about everything. One feels so much out of it in this forsaken place. For that matter, I am not sure that I do not feel even more out of it when I am in London nowadays. The plain fact, which to you, my dear friend, I may mention quite candidly, is that I am definitely middle-aged. I am just 40. I have grown fatter, or, as most of my dear friends are probably putting it at this present moment, I have coarsened. On the whole, it is perhaps as well that the illness of my children and the usual doctor's formula have brought me to a hideous and minstrel-haunted seaside. When I am in London, I am so much less sought after nowadays that I grow full of bitterness. After one has had the feast, one should lose the hunger. If I had the making of this world, I would make it differently, in many respects. I did have the feast. They say that I have 2 suicides to my credit, and some minor heart-breakages. I could do what I liked. Everybody was always trying to get me to go to their things. I was in the academy 3 years running, and always by a first-rate man. And the kind people say that I must have been a beauty once, and the unkind people say that I have coarsened. By the way, do you remember the portrait that Hallam did of me 15 years ago, just before I was married? He would not sell it, and Harry was rather mad about it. Well, Hallam's dead, and has left the portrait specifically to Harry in his will. It is the one where I am all in white, playing with a kitten. My God, what a fool I should look all in white, playing with a kitten now! However, Harry is delighted to have got the portrait, and writes that he has hung it in the library at our house in Hill Street. He does not come down here, by the way, which is scandalous of him. However, he writes letters inquiring affectionately about the children. How one loses everything when one is middle-aged. This is a boresome letter, all about myself, but you know what the seaside is. There is nothing in one's surroundings which will bear thinking about for one moment. A woman with a fringe and a portable harmonium, neither of which suits her in the least, has just planted herself in the street outside these windows, and a husky baritone, with Cockney accent, is singing, "There's only one girl in this world for me." What a life! Yes, the children are better, thanks. Write again soon. Second extract. Bearing the address of a house in Hill Street, W. When one deteriorates in value, one ought, I suppose, to become much cheaper. I am seriously thinking of becoming much cheaper. I could still, on the title, get a parcel of little Jews and people from the city to run about after me. No, I was joking, and not in the best taste. In 5 years' time I shall be all resignation and black cashmere, a peaceful, grey-haired old lady with a saintly life and a spotless reputation, which is acquired by those who can neither tempt nor be tempted. That again is rather horrible, and I am inclined to write no more until I am in a better frame of mind. However, let's try and look at the bright side of things. The children are quite well, and that is a blessing. Harry gives me no trouble whatsoever. Of course, I knew he was a maniac when I married him. I rather liked him for it. My picture by Hallam in the library has flowers before it perpetually, and lighted candles in the evening. He spends most of the day there with the door locked. Sometimes for 2 or 3 days I never exchange 3 words with him. This is rather funny, as we are both living in the same house. I really fancy he must be a little mad. I could understand his neglecting me, which he does in the kindest and most gentlemanly way, since I am middle-aged and fat and ugly, or shall we say coarsened. Men don't age so quickly as women, and he is still far from being an old man. That is why I want to know who the enemy is. When he stopped caring a pin's head about me, who was it for whom he began to care all the world? Who is the enemy? I do not say this by way of complaint. As I said, I am looking now at the bright side of things. So far as I can make out, there is not at this moment in the world a single woman for whom Harry cares twopence. But then, as I said, he is a maniac. Third extract, bearing an address at Grandtown, Morayshire. I am getting seriously annoyed with Harry. I hate to see money fooled away. He is not a pauper, but his expenditure should at least be reasonable. The children and I, with the servants, came on here first. He followed a few days afterwards, and he followed in a special train, if you please. When I remonstrated with him on the absurdity of it, he said that he did not take the train for his own sake. As there was nobody else in it, except his valet and the railway officials, I should be glad to know for whose sake he did take it. By the way, as a further sign of his mania, in the same train he brought with him Hallin's portrait of me from our house in Hill Street. The same silly nonsense with the flowers and candles, and the locked room has gone on here. At first I was pleased, even a little flattered by his adoration of this portrait, but I confess that it begins to madden me exceedingly now. One or two of the people staying in the house have made little jokes about it, which I resented very much. One young idiot spoke of the portrait to me the other night as my only possible rival. When the truth is expounded to you by a fool, it is even more infuriating than the truth generally is. I like this place. I do not care if I never go back to London again. I hate society. I hate most things. I think I shall hate Harry, only I am hardly on familiar enough terms with him to do that. Fourth extract, dated a month later, from the same address. We have had a scene. That is my great piece of news. A very serious scene. Partly as a kind of practical joke, and partly to satisfy my own feeling, last night while the men were lingering over their cigarettes, I got to the shrine of my sacred portrait of his worship, and cut it out of the frame and burnt it. An oil painting, by the way, takes a good deal of burning. It has to be done in sections. I was just finishing off the last little piece. It had my hand on it, with the engagement ring on one of my fingers, when Harry and the rest came in. As I said to him afterwards, I do not in the least mind his losing his temper, and it is quite immaterial to me whether he is in a good temper or a bad, but I will not have him lose his temper with me before people. Last night it was really most embarrassing. You never heard such a volley of abuse. Nobody knew what to do or where to look or what to say. I laughed at him all the time. Amongst other kindly remarks of his was one that he would much sooner I had cut myself up in pieces and burned them. Since writing the above I have seen Harry. He declines to live in the same house with me any more, and has gone back to town for the present. The funny thing is, he says he cannot stand, even for a moment, the presence of a woman whom jealousy has rendered absolutely insane. If it comes to a question of sanity, I may have something to say. There will be a separation, I suppose, judicial or otherwise. I do not much care. P.S. Thanks for the pamphlet on Diet for the Obese. I shan't trouble about it, though. I think I shall live on the Continent in the future. That is the place for the used up. However, I have killed the enemy now. Idle in a churchyard. The churchyard stood well above the village. The nearest way to it was by a path over the fields. At present it lay very quiet in the cool of the summer evening, until the quiet was broken by the creak of two large new boots. A man of 45, with a complicated face in deep mourning, and a lavish band upon his hat, came creeping around the corner of the church, and then creaked across the grass to a well-kept grave. The face was complicated because it told such different things. Years of small commerce in the country had lent it much of the parochial and commonplace, but the eyes were those of a tired epicure. The tombstone told in gilt lettering that it was sacred to the memory of Lavinia, for 17 years the pious and devoted wife of Alexander Hythe. The date of the decease was very recent. A quotation from a favorite hymn completed the inscription. The man removed a very shiny black glove, a glove which had blue highlights on it in the sun, and began to pull up one or two weeds, adjusted the cross of everlastings, which was not quite straight. Then he drew that terrible kid glove on again, and folded his fat hands together, and closed his tearless eyes. He opened his eyes again when he heard a step on the gravel. The woman, who had once been good-looking, came along the path toward him. She was neatly dressed in a brown coat and skirt, and she had small feet and hands. One of the hands carried a bunch of white roses. She came across the grass to the mourner, and said good evening, timidly, and feared that she had intruded. Then she laid her roses on the grave, and would have slipped away, but the man stopped her. "You needn't go, Mrs. Burgess," he said heavily. Not at least so far as I'm concerned. I just wanted to leave those few roses, she said. You see, not being a relation, I don't wear any mourning. George, in fact, objected to it just for the funeral. He said that it was carrying things too far. Still, she and I were always friends, but I do feel that I am intruding. It was a pity I chose just this time. What for? Said the man, almost savagely. You've got all the right here that I have, and perhaps more. Pious and devoted wife, it says. She was pious, too. I've never seen the weather yet that would keep her out of the church Sunday morning or Sunday evening, not while she had the strength to walk. Devoted, too, said the woman warmly. Yes, said the man drearily. Lavinia was devoted enough. She knew her place and never went out of it. She had always got a sharp eye to my interest. How I'm to replace her in the shop I really don't know, but... Well, said the woman a little eagerly. You know, he said bitterly. You know well enough. Regular hell, that's what it was. And I may as well say the truth about some living being and get it over. It was your fault, too. Mine? The woman gasped. Yes, said the man. I was a boy when I married her, and I was in love with you all the time. I never told you so. I never breathed a word of it till this moment. I dare say it comes as a shock to you. I never knew it, the woman said huskily. How could you? You were rather a cut above me, and you took all the care you could to keep out of my way. I wasn't going to make a fool of myself then, and though I don't seem to care so much now. Lavinia was ready, and one thing led to another. Well, I wouldn't put a lie on a tombstone or anywhere else. She was a pious and devoted wife, and you may leave it at that. I did my duty by her, too. This last illness, money was not spared, I can tell you. I could show you some of the bills, though of course it's no use. Some of the things I could get at trade prices, but not chemist stuff, of course. You may say that she had everything she wanted, and I've had nothing that I wanted. Nothing. Not one solitary thing all my life. The woman looked away from him and out into the distance. She spoke hesitatingly. At that time, when we were quite young, boy and girl together, I suppose it never occurred to you. What? Said the man, and as he looked at her he knew. For a minute or two neither of them spoke. Perhaps I shouldn't have let myself go like this, said the man, shyly and apologetically. When one has kept silence for so many years, one might go on to the end. I should have remembered that you were a married woman, too. I ought to have asked after your husband. No worse, I hope? The woman nodded, shivered, and began to cry. He came nearer to her, and she ran away from him down the path. The next day Mr. Hythe made some inquiries for a woman to help him in the shop to do the work that his late wife had done. He explained that it would just be a temporary appointment. The Life Underground, from the unpublished letters of Horace Marsh of Soxwold. So, my dear Edward, it is all over. My sanity is proved to the satisfaction of the lawyers and the medicine men, and poor Herbert will not at present have the management of my affairs. I fear he is sadly disappointed. I have made a new will today, and when nature calls me from this world, and the contents of that will become known, he will be sadly disappointed again. It is possible that he will try once more then. The old stories of the temple of Aphrodite in the park and of my underground mansion, and of the immense sums that I have squandered on them, will be brought out again. Anything to prove that I was not of a sound disposing mind. Really, the newspapers ought to subsidize poor Herbert. He gives them such stories. And what will you say in my defense when that day comes and I can no longer speak for myself? You have an easy tolerance, Edward. You admit that I have spent these vast sums, and that I have spent them on objects on which the ordinary rich man would not care to spend 2d. But as you pointed out to Herbert, the money was mine to do with as I would, nor am I, in spite of all the expense, ruined in fortune. On the question of my desire at times to live underground, you refuse to see any evidence of madness there. Every man, you added truly, has some eccentricity or other. Yes, I am sanguine enough and optimistic enough to believe that even the most commonplace of mortals, a governess or a minor poet, in some respect, mere trifle though it may be, is differentiated from all the others. But if you import into that word eccentricity any hint of irrationality or weakness, then, so far as my underground life is concerned, I join issue with you. I have my reasons for what I do. Nor can I admit that I am so very unusual. The temporary withdrawal from the world is a luxury for many natures, and a necessity for some. It may be the desert, or the mountain top, or the hermit's cave, or, as in my own case, the more complete seclusion of an underground dwelling. One would hear more of such things if more men had the courage of their opinions, or could pay the price of their satisfaction. Imagine, if you can, all that the iron outer doors of the descending stairs shut out for me. Down there the engines of the world are stopped and the rattle is still. There is no fatal recurrence of day and night, and one loses that intolerable sense of time going on as a turning wheel in a vast mill where mortals are but the grain. Down there it is always the same light, and always the same hour. The past that I spent in the world above becomes to me quite unreal, and the present moment is perfect rest. And the future? There seems to be none. The engines of the world are stopped. I am no longer the grain in the mill. I am the captain of my soul. Free will may still be a delusion, but the delusion is complete. You shake your head and talk of neurasthenia. Names have never frightened me. You may call it that if you like, and you may call my life underground the treatment. For it is due to that withdrawn and secluded life that I can come back to the world sane and steady, and convince the medicine men, and disinherit poor Herbert. Names do not frighten me, but I am a coward before facts. This to the ordinary man is an idyllic spot in the open country, a peaceful resting place for the over-civilized and over-tired. It is not so to me. It is full of torturing facts. I stand appalled as much before the needless and inevitable fecundity as before the pitiless and inevitable destructiveness of nature. All that is inevitable is to me terrifying. It is nothing that the streams run downward, and that the stone released from my hand falls to the ground. But it is everything to me that the stream must run downward, and that the stone must fall. It gives me no sensation of beneficent law and order. I feel as if I were being carried away, I knew not whither, and some machine that I can neither control nor understand. I am frightened. And just as a terrified child buries his head under the bedclothes, so I go to my underground dwelling, the expensive construction of which annoyed poor Herbert so much. Do not tell me, since I am well aware of it, that time goes on, and the natural laws are not suspended below ground. I know it, but down there the evidence is less overpowering. Do not think either that this terror is always with me. If it had been so, poor Herbert would have had his way. There are days when a flower is to me the same thing of beauty and fragrance that it is to others, and nights when I can listen to the nightingales in my garden with joy. I can talk then without great trouble of local politics and cricket scores to the somewhat indifferent specimens of my species that live in this neighborhood. I am, to use your favorite word, normal. And then the day comes when I can see nothing in the flower but a grotesque and purposeless reproduction of its kind, and when the song of a nesting bird is more bitter for its beauty, when every village child in the street is a tragedy, on every life, every useless life, is a senseless death for its birthmark. And this is, of course, especially terrible in the springtime. The wheel is at the height of its revolution, the furnace roars, the engine throbs, the mighty machine that makes and breaks us works overtime. If only one could find in nature the least human analogy. If only in the purpose at the back of things one could discern a standard of values which was humanly comprehensible. But it is not so. Nature knows nothing of utility, or beauty, or nobility as we know them. It knows nothing even of cruelty. If it were maliciously inhuman one might bear it, but it is not human, and the highest we can think or do may be a jest elsewhere to other beings. And since it is now the springtime, my dear Edward, and since poor Herbert has made me very tired, you will not hear of me for a week or two. End of chapter 15. Recording by Susanna Mason. Chapter 16 of Stories in Grey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susanna Mason. Stories in Grey by Barry Payne. Miniatures Part 3. 10. Sorrow in the Country. The poet walked along the winding lane on the hillside in springtime. A mile back a cart had met him, a slow, heavy cart whose driver lolled in a beery drowsiness, the reins slack in one drooped hand. Since then he had seen no one. On either side the hazels showed their delicate green, the bluebells grew in profusion. Under the hedge the half-opened curves of the uncommon ferns still made their faithful promises. Below him lay the plantation, dusky and mysterious. Lower still, not far from the village, came the rat-a-tat of the workman's hammer, for there the trees had been cleared, and some human brute was building for himself a big house where he should give dinner parties, and be just about as common as other people. But for that, there was, the poet felt, a pleasure in the suggestion that the scene offered him. a sense of solitude without dreariness, of remoteness not too remote. A half-hour's descent would have taken him down to the village, humming there in the haze. A turn of the lane brought him suddenly upon a cottage with thatched roof and white walls. It stood in a little garden, old-fashioned, where the white rhododendrons and big red peonies opened slowly, a restrained yet inevitable outburst of delights. The garden merged haphazard into an orchard. The white pear blossom, most precious of all to the bees, had already paid its tribute and ended its little day of beauty. But the apple trees were glorious in the sun, healthy, sturdy Blenheims, and here and there a rare ribstone, showing where a dead arm had been lopped off, dying out, the sickly mother of the finest fruit. Are there not also fine poems from men with a moral ear, and all the rest of the stigmata? And as in that old rhyme, someone was in the garden hanging out the clothes. She was hanging out the clothes of a most intimate character, with a simplicity and a total absence of embarrassment possible when facts are comprehensible, but suggestions an unknown language. The poet liked that particularly. There was nothing shirked. The beauty of the scene was intrinsic, not gained by a pettifogging trick of trimming and cutting out what was ugly. It was beautiful because it had not cared, and did not care anything at all about that. The heavenly pinkish snow from the shaken apple trees was due to the same breeze that played vulgar monkey tricks with the hanging clothes. She wore a print gown of pale mauve and a coarse apron. Neither of them, examined closely, would have been found to be quite clean. They did for working in, and it was work that threw her into a grand pose. Her head was thrown back, her arms raised high, the dress strained over the deep bosom. She would have been the delight of a sculptor, and the despair of a fashion plate. Tall, erect, strong, shapely, she seemed as one to come back from the old days, before we grew so clever and so chétif. A relic of the healthy animal that dies out of the race as our poisonous civilization does its work. Red lips, big eyes, a mass of black hair twisted up anyhow, the melancholy, one might almost have said sulkiness, of her unintelligent expression. The poet noted them all. He noted, too, with delight, that the mouth was too large, and the hands and part of the splendid forearm were red from the wash-tub. That was right. It was all so good because it was so true, and you could afford to see everything. With the quick enthusiasm of a poet, he wondered how it would be if he stepped across the grass, took her in his arms and kissed her, and as soon as might be, set the wedding bells a-jingling. That she would marry him he had no doubt, not for the offer of his person, an unseemly mixture of the puny and the portly, but for his position, and money and laziness and fine clothes and the envy of others. It was not for his own sake that he gave up the mad scheme, though he recognized what misery the load of years with her might mean. It was because he felt there was something that belonged to the garden and to solitude, and that would die if transplanted. He would not even cross the grass to her with the pretext of asking his way, lest her voice should shrilly disappoint him. Rustic words and accent he welcomed as the truth, but the voice, he heard it in imagination as a contralto. Also the poet was, as poets so often are, just a little bit afraid. At that moment she turned and looked at him curiously, and with a clumsy pretense of a pause to light a cigarette, he passed on. He reflected that their curiosities would be slightly different. She would ask herself if he was stopping down at the Lion, and if he was one of those artists, and there she would leave it. His wonder as to her was wider and deeper. Memory, for a whim, marked that page as one that was to remain, and years afterward the poet, dying, recalled the scene. On the evening of the day on which he saw her, long after the rat-a-tat of the hammer had ceased, in the big, unfinished house below, when the crescent moon relieved the growing dusk, she came out of the cottage. The old people were chatting in the kitchen, and it would have been remarked if she had run upstairs. But out here one was not observed, and for a while she sobbed passionately, leaning against the trunk of an apple tree. She sobbed not on account of the poet, of whom she had not thought twice, but on account of the beery giant whom he had met driving half asleep the heavy cart. 11. A Civil War. Miss Annabel Blake and Miss Jessica Winch possessed certain points of resemblance. They were about the same age and had about the same moderate income. Both were plain, slightly eccentric, sturdy, and even pugnacious. Both of them hated men and loved gardening. Both were independent, methodical, and hot-tempered. Both had quarreled with all their relations. It was chiefly on that account that at the age of 30 they decided to join their forces and take a house and garden in the country together. The relations smiled and said they would give that arrangement just a month to last. They calculated that by then Annabel and Jessica would have flown at each other's throats and parted forever. But the relations were wrong. Both of the ladies were shrewd enough to see that the only possible modus vivendi was one which, as far as possible, left to each her independence. A book of rules was drawn up in manuscript, each lady possessing her own copy. As the years went on, the rules grew in number, to meet every occasion. They were agreed to by both parties, and there were fines for breaking them, and the fines were always paid. The making of these rules caused a good deal of friction, generally ending in an even compromise. Neither lady could claim to be the predominant partner. Gradually the spirit of an accurately measured give and take grew up between them. The compromise might, for instance, have been traced in Rule 78, which ordained that fires in the reception rooms were permissible only between 6 p.m. of October 15th and 10:30 p.m. of the following April 23rd. It took 2 evenings of animated discussion to make that rule. Once made, it passed into the things beyond discussion, and there was no more trouble about it. An entire absence of anything that could possibly have been called a sense of humor helped them. Thanks to the rules and compromises, Miss Blake and Miss Winch managed to live together for 20 years. They did not pretend to have much mutual affection, but they enjoyed a little sharpness of the tongue. Perfect calm would have bored them. They had, however, a certain amount of mutual respect, since neither was a person who could be put upon, and from the similarity of their taste it was probably easier for each to live with the other than with anyone else. Besides, there was a distinct saving of money from living together, and though they were not precisely miserly, they liked good management. But in the 21st year, in the springtime, when the birds were singing prettily, and the blossoms were looking lovely, and nature generally seemed smiling and peaceful, the great war broke out between the two ladies. The war had its origin in the garden. The paths and lawns were common ground, though the care of the paths was assigned to Miss Winch, while Miss Blake was responsible for the lawn. The rest of the garden was divided into equal parts. By Rule 3, Miss Blake owned and cultivated that part of the garden on the left side of the path, and Miss Winch owned and cultivated the other half on the right side. They employed no gardener, and needed none. These two ladies of 50 could do a piece of hard digging, and no nonsense about it, as well as most men. There were rules that a certain proportion of each allotment was to be kitchen garden, and the crops for these were to be settled in January by discussion. Otherwise the two ladies might have had too much of one thing and none of another. This discussion was much less fiery than might have been expected. The capabilities of the land and of its cultivators had been early recognized. When a difficulty did arise, a short squabble and a sternly just compromise settled it. The rest of the allotments, the flower gardens, never came under the discussion at all. There each proprietor, by Rule 15, was supreme. Now it happened that Miss Winch, in turning over her seed packet one evening, came on one that bore no label and no indication of its contents. Miss Blake expressed her opinion, to give her exact words, that Jessica Winch was a careless fool. Miss Winch said that she had never seen the packet before, and the seedman must have sent it by mistake. It was probably rubbish, and she should burn it. She added that people who forgot to get the crumb tray repaired should not call other people careless fools. Miss Blake said that people who burned seeds deserved to live to want bread to eat. Jessica said that Annabel could have the packet for a penny, and the money was paid. Annabel sowed that seed, and it flourished exceedingly. It was a foreign weed, as ugly, vindictive, and prolific as a Chinaman. Where it was put in there was the base of operations for evermore. So the war began, and so far Miss Winch had the right on her side. Miss Blake made a heap of the weed and set fire to it on a day when the wind carried the smoke across Jessica's allotment. For this infringement of Rule 70 she was fined 4d. Jessica then threw a healthy collection of large snails across into Miss Blake's flower beds. Miss Blake appealed to Rule 35, under which rubbish from one allotment might not be deposited on the other. Miss Winch objected, under the plea that rubbish meant something dead, and that the snails were alive. Miss Blake said, "Very well," and spent an afternoon in getting together an army of fat caterpillars for Jessica's roses. In a week's time the two ladies had ceased to speak to one another, whenever speech could be avoided, and took their meals separately. They would undoubtedly have separated altogether and lived apart, but then one day in July, when Jessica was hurrying to the nearest town to get her will altered, she was knocked over by a cart and killed. That stopped the war. So Miss Blake, having inherited all her enemy's possessions, now lives in the old house alone, and her temper is a little more fiendish than before. So the gardener says, who is now called in to help. He looks after the lawn and the paths, and is permitted to work on Miss Blake's side of the garden. But Miss Blake herself works much harder, with more knowledge and with more contentiousness, in the garden of her dead enemy. It is on that side that most of the money is spent. Miss Blake surveyed it one summer evening when it was at its best. "I think," she said, "that Jessica would be satisfied." 12. His life's work. The day had been spent very quietly. Now that the work of 30 years was finished, there was none of the triumph of completion, and not even the sense of relief that is so often felt when a long task is at length laid aside. All through the house the tone was grave, almost mournful. The old man, in his spare hours that science had left him, had found some time to win the love of many. This change frightened him. They were anxious about him. What would he do with his mornings now? He had never been easy to interest, of politics he knew nothing. He thought of art generally as a pleasant parlour game for ladies. Science and the ties of personal affection had been the only realities for him, and he was about to give up half of his realities. Yes, after the work would come the reward. They did not forget that. The book was not for the general reader, but it was certain of magnificent reception from the learned. It was a book that had been long expected, for which the scientific world was impatient. Yes, for a time he would find occupation in seeing the book through the press, and then there would be the honour and glory. But what after that? He had been so inseparably linked with the preparation of that book. His health had been good or bad, proportionately as the work had gone well or ill. And it so happened that on the day that he announced the completion of the manuscript, side by side with the spoken words of cheerful congratulation went thoughts that were grave and apprehensive. The little old gentleman himself took the whole affair with a certain dignity. He gave no sign of exultation or depression. In fact, he was scarcely conscious of what his own feelings were, but he told himself that it was vulgar to expect and base to fear. After dinner he retired to the library instead of joining his family in the drawing-room as usual, and took from the deepest of the drawers in the writing-table this precious manuscript, finished and ready for the printer. The library was a large room, furnished in the simplest manner, and the simplicity was not an arranged simplicity. It was so, not in the least because he had tried to make it simple, but because he had never tried to make it elaborate. It was not the simplicity of a consciously severe taste, but the less pleasing result of pure chance. The incongruous presence of friends and relatives mingled with the essential apparatus of his studies. One wondered how anybody who wanted that big microscope could also want that violet wool mat, or the Crystolian representation of a stout naiad. He had never been guilty of adding one decoration to the room himself, but if people gave him things, well, it was very kind of them. It was Aunt Alice who had given him the pair of candlesticks that he now placed on the table beside his book. They were of white china, and bore views of some of the more tempting parts of Eastbourne. He had never desired them, but he used them with gratitude, and lighted the candles with a match from a box that bore the needless and innocent inscription, "Strike a light." He drew from among the sheets of his book a large diagram, full of minute detail, drawn with exquisite neatness, and peered closely at it. No, there was nothing to correct and nothing to add. To the best of his ability it was finished. He put down the sheet and leaned back in his chair. He did not share the apprehension of his relatives about his future. If he pictured it at all, he saw himself busy with an interminable correspondence arising out of his book. Not all the letters that he would receive would be pleasant. There was a deal of jealousy about, even in the scientific world. But there would be the congratulatory messages as well. The effects of the book, as he imagined them, would last for years and years, all the years that were likely to be left him. The work of preparing new editions would alone be enough to keep him fully occupied. He reminded himself that it was vulgar to expect, but in a few minutes he was thinking out phrases of a suitable modesty to use in a reply to an illuminated address from a learned body. Why not? There were 30 years' work, unusual resources, great devotion, and yes, some intelligence in the book. It deserved recognition, and with this comforting thought he grew drowsy and nodded off to sleep in his chair. In his sleep he had a dream. He was present at a great banquet, and he became aware that the banquet was given in his honour, and that he would shortly be expected to speak. He had no feeling of nervousness. In his hand there were notes of his speech already written out, but he felt absolutely independent of them. He was full of the happiest ideas, inspired with telling phrases, conscious of power. At last the moment came, and amid loud applause he rose to his feet. He almost whispered the prefatory formula. This was calculated. Managing his voice to perfection, he became more audible as he referred in well-chosen language to the interest which His Royal Highness had always shown in the work of the Society, and to the honour that he conferred upon them by his presence. Then he paused, and allowed the courteous applause to die away before getting to the real business of his speech. Raising his voice, and with a noble sweeping gesture, he continued, "Whenever I gaze, I see before me—" And at that moment the arm of the sleeper shot out and upset one of the white china candlesticks with the views upon them. It fell over on the pile of manuscript, the one copy of the great work, waiting for the printer. Awake? No, he sleeps on, as though nothing had happened. When you knock over a lighted candle, the candle, except in stories, is generally extinguished by the draught occasioned by the fall. That is what happened in this instance. The precious manuscript was absolutely uninjured, except for a spot of grease which was removed with a flat iron and a blotting paper on the following day. And many a time since that night he has longed, how ardently, that the flame had not failed in its work, that the child had been stillborn, that the work had never seen daylight. Within a week of its publication, an elderly, round-faced German brought out another book on the same subject, the result of 40 years' study, of greater resources, and of finer intelligence. The junior partner in the firm which published the little gentleman's book committed suicide, and the book, which was to have been the standard work on the subject for the next 10 years, fell flat and unnoticed, and the old gentleman immediately commenced another. But this is a work which will require many more years yet, and he is no chicken. 13. The end of the story. The two old ladies took a penny weekly paper, and took it very seriously. Its due delivery on Saturday morning by the village newsvendor was a notable event. They fixed dates by remembering the week when the Saturday Miscellany failed to arrive. A local train had broken down, and the paper did not come till the following Monday, and the earth, so far as the old ladies knew it, was upside down. They did not glance hurriedly through it, and then fling it aside. They read every word, and commented sagely and soberly upon it. Incidentally, it solved a problem for them. They had never varied from their strict upbringing, and they were forbidden by their consciences to read novels on Sunday. But they were not forbidden to read the Sunday Miscellany. Was it not, as its name implied, a Sunday paper? Was it not edited by a clergyman? And it possessed a serial story. They followed every installment with their keenest interest. They were critical, too, but rather of the characters in the story than of the author's work. Where he was wrong, Priscilla would say, speaking of the hero in Percival's Atonement, was in going to London at all. The good bishop had warned him of the temptations which awaited him there. I cannot help feeling sorry for him, but so far as I can see from the last chapter this week, that poor boy is going to the bad. I hope not, said her sister seriously. It does not look like it in this week, but I pin my faith in that girl Olive Lorraine. I feel convinced that we shall hear a good deal more of her, and I can see already that she is taking an interest in him. However, we shall see next week. It is just unfortunate that every week the story stops just at some point when one wants to know more, but I suppose it is unavoidable. The editor would have been pleased if he had heard that. The serial stories in the Sunday Miscellany were innocuous and stereotyped. The lurid light which they cast on the high life of London was never too lurid. Virtue was always triumphant, and the end was always happy. But with the two old ladies these stories never missed their mark. When in the very first chapter Percival plunged into the dark pool to rescue the drowning kitten, and his father exclaimed, "It is all over, we shall never see him alive again," it never occurred to the old ladies to ask how on earth the serial story was going to get on if the hero died in the very first chapter. On the contrary, they took a pessimistic view of the situation. "Thank heaven he's alive!" exclaimed Priscilla, as she anxiously attacked the next week's installment. "Was he injured?" asked her sister eagerly. "He speaks of a strain on his nervous system, and says he is still very feeble." That Percival was pretty feeble all the way through the story. But he had a sunny smile and curly hair. Even his London excesses could not quite destroy the old lady's affectionate admiration of him. Percival's Atonement was a very long serial. The clerical editor, who paid starvation prices in any case, had got a reduction on taking a quantity. At the end of 6 months Percival was safely engaged to that charming lady, Olive Lorraine, but in the dim twilight he had accidentally espied her kissing another man. He did not ask for any explanation. He merely became seriously ill and moaned a good deal. The Percivals of fiction are like that. And just at this juncture Priscilla, the elder of the two sisters, also fell ill. It was a sudden illness and ended in her death. She knew that she was dying. One Sunday afternoon she had lain for a long time without speaking. Her sister had read out to her the chapters of the current number of the Sunday Miscellany, and sat by the fireside waiting for a chance to do something else for Priscilla. In the silence the clock seemed to tick laboriously, as if the quiet of the room had nearly overwhelmed it. "I cannot believe," said Priscilla at last, "that Olive Lorraine was guilty. It seems so unlike her. In the twilight a man might very easily make a mistake. It was probably some other girl. Or," said her sister, "the man may turn out to have been her brother or her father. It is, perhaps, a pity that Percival did not think of these things. I should have liked to have known how the story ended before I died." "Nonsense," said her sister. "You're much better. Anybody can see that." Priscilla shook her head. That night she got little sleep. Her mind was too much worried about Olive Lorraine and Percival. To the sick woman these absurd characters out of the stupid story had become intensely real. She babbled of them at times when she was light-headed. And her sister wrote a letter to the author of Percival's Atonement, and got a reply of a favourable character by return of post. It was a quite unusually good-natured author. The sister went to Priscilla in triumph. "I thought, my dear, that your anxiety about Olive and Percival was perhaps making your recovery rather slower than it should be." "Yes," said Priscilla. "If only I knew that they were safely through this trouble, I feel that my mind would be easier." "I have taken rather a liberty, Priscilla. I have written to the author of the story explaining the circumstances, and I have had the most kind reply from him. He sends me some long slips of paper on which the rest of the story is printed." "It is kind of him and of you," said Priscilla. "Very kind." She seemed to hesitate. "Would you like me to read them out to you now?" "No," said Priscilla firmly. "It is very kind of you both, but I must not take advantage of it. It would be irregular. It would even be a little dishonourable. To my mind it seems very much like cheating at patience. You are not offended?" "No, dear, of course not." "And, you see," Priscilla added, "I shall know the end of all the stories so soon now." 14. The Artistic Success. Monodrama. Act 1. The scene is a garden, old-fashioned, with high yew hedges. In one of the shaded walks, Percival Joy Smith, aged 8, passes to and fro, lost in thought. He is attired in pale green plush and frills, surmounted by a foolish beef-eater hat. He has a bad loose mouth, no chin, splendid eyes, and a roomy head of queer shape. He speaks. "Yes, if we are to be strictly accurate, I have thrown the cat on the fire, stolen the money of my governess, and told 3 large but unsuccessful lies. My governess is perhaps at this moment reporting my offences to mamma. If not, she is but waiting for the return of my father, in order to appeal to the sterner tribunal. It is time that I looked out for myself. Flight? I think not. I am aware that in books about boys one runs away, and has ideas about going to sea, and is in other respects very absurd. It may even be that such things sometimes happen, but not in the case of a thoughtful and observant boy with a sentimental mother. He knows something better, and he dislikes adventure, as a rule, and he prefers to take his meals regularly. Remorse? That is very good if it is done on a large scale, and includes the refusal of food and sleep, and is accompanied by floods of tears and lasts for days. But all this is very tiring and trying, and tends to lessen one's self-respect. It will be a better plan to say something. Whenever I say something, mamma writes it down in a little book, and puts the date to it. If there are visitors here, and I say something that attracts a little attention, I can do what I like with mamma afterwards. My words speak louder than my actions. That is fortunate, for I find words comparatively easy. Before I try to explain to mamma that I was holding the cat up to the window so that it could see out, and that I dropped it onto the fire accidentally, and that I took the money to give to the missionaries, and that the lies were not real lies, but statements made in joke, before I proceed to these explanations, I should certainly say something that will give them colour and probability. I think, on the whole, I could not do better than to go into the drawing-room with a grave face and upturned eyes, and ask mamma if the stars are God's daisy chain." He does so. Act 2. The scene is a third-floor bed-sitting-room in Doughty Street. It is furnished exactly like a third-floor bed-sitting-room in Doughty Street. In it sits Percival Joy Smith, aged 25. He wears a shabby tweed suit of a large pattern. He looks dirty, intemperate, and partially starved. He smokes cigarettes, his fingers are stained with them, and he looks through his letters received by the second post. He speaks. "So, the governor has found it out and stopped it, and the mater ain't to send me any more money. She will continue to write. Plucky lot of good that is without the cash. I never asked to be born into this beast of a world. It was their lookout. But if they're going to shirk their responsibilities, and I own that the mater has hung on as long as she could, I suppose I must look out for myself. And that's not so easy to look out for oneself when one has been expelled from 2 schools, sent down from Oxford, has lost one's character, and been abandoned by one's friends. I could dig, but I won't. I'm not in the least ashamed to beg, but I have no luck, and I should have a cart-load of Miss Sendy societies down to me in no time. At the first glance it seems that all means of livelihood are closed to me. I have still 100 of the money that the governor sent me to pay my Oxford bills when he cut me off, but even with that little capital to invest I see no occupation for me which would be remunerative and pleasing." He smokes 2 cigarettes, drinks a little gin and water, and resumes. "There are just 2 things that seem to me to be left for a man of spotted character. I might join a mission and preach, or I might write a great book. In my youth, and since then, I have found the utility of saying things. It is only a question of saying things again, but to the sentimental, mother-hearted public this time. Yes, I will write a work of genius." He does so. Act 3. The scene is a small flat in Davy Street, W. It is a dull November afternoon, and the room scene is lit with wax candles, free from the rose shades so dear to the fashionable writers of the halfpenny home blitherings. The room is furnished with exquisite severity, and is one of the few rooms to the west of London at that time that are not overcrowded with furniture. It is unsullied by bamboo, or the portiere, or the imitation Chippendale table for the exhibit of 3 and 6 penny silver boxes and ornaments. Percival Joy Smith, correctly dressed, aged 30, sits at a writing table. He speaks. "So here and at my cottage in Sunning I have everything I want, and 5 years ago I had nothing but debts and a bad reputation. Then I starved, and now almost my only source of anxiety is my waist measurement. Then I was but Smith, and now I am Percival Joy, the author of Stay With Me, and several other popular novels. Yes, several other popular novels. That was a beastly thing in the critical review about that. The old parrot city of excessive production, spite in the guise of kindliness. Oh, damn the thing. It's the penalty of artistic success, and one must put up with it. It's so good for one, success. To be thought of well of, without having to do much to deserve it, makes one moral. I shall write to my father and mother and say that I forgive them, though they never understood me." He does so. Act 4. The scene is as in Act 2. The time is 3 o'clock on a summer morning. The dawn comes through a green blind and lights the shabby, narrow bed. On it, clad in bright blue pajamas, lies Percival Joy Smith, aged 40. He is bald, unshaven, wide awake and tremulous. Beside him, on a wicker-seated chair, are a medicine bottle, a glass, a stump of candle in a painted china candlestick, some letters, and a smouldering cigarette end in a Jubilee ashtray. He speaks. "Popularity, money, like come and like go with both of them. The fashions change. Oh, goodness, yes, we are wearing our stories rather longer this season. Selling a good deal of adventure just now. Sin and epigrams are quite out. They are overdone. Some of the smart people are in favor of the simple pagan. Percival Joy? Oh, never asked for nowadays. It was a quick fire, but it's blazed quite out. Dead out." He takes up the letters and grins. "They're all so damn polite. Porter regrets exceedingly that he has no work to offer worthy of my attention. Simpson thinks that to put with me on reviewing would be to cut wood with a razor. Wilton thanks me most cordially for my kind offer, but fears he has no vacancy at present. All alike. They know I'm done. My own fault? Wickedness? Any amount. Extravagant living? Of course. Add to it all the rest of my purulent mess that goes on to make up an artist of my type. But don't forget the kind of world it is. A fine world for tailors." He pours from the bottle and drinks. 3 doses instead of 1. So when my landlady comes to turn me out of this place of luxury tomorrow, she will be disappointed. After all, one can die." He does so. End of chapter 16. Recording by Susanna Mason.
Stories in Grey by Barry Payne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barney Hallowell. Linda. My elder brother, Lorimer, married 10 years ago the daughter of a tenant farmer. I was at that time a boy at school, already interested in the work which has since made me fairly well known, and I took very little interest in Lorimer or my sister-in-law. From time to time I saw her, of course, when I paid brief visits to their farm in Dorsetshire during the holidays. But I did not greatly enjoy these visits. Lorimer seemed to me to become daily more morose and taciturn. His wife had the mind of a heavy peasant, deeply interested in her farm and in little else, and only redeemed from the commonplace by her face. I have heard men speak of her as being very beautiful, and as being hideous. Already an artist, I saw the point of it all at once. Her eyes were not quite human. Sometimes, when she was angry with a servant over some trivial piece of neglect, they looked like the eyes of a devil. She was exceedingly superstitious, and had little education. Our guardian had the good sense to send me to Paris to complete my art education, and one snowy March I was recalled suddenly from Paris to his deathbed. I was at this time 22 years of age, and of course the technical guardianship had ceased. Accounts had been rendered. Lorimer had taken his share of my father's small fortune, and I had taken mine. But we both felt a great regard for this uncle, who, during so many years, had been in the place of a father to us. I found Lorimer at the house when I arrived, and learned then, for the first time, that our uncle had strongly disapproved of his marriage. He spoke of it in the partially conscious moments which preceded his end, and he said some queer things. I heard little, because Lorimer asked me to go out. After my guardian's death, Lorimer returned to his farm, and I to my studies in Paris. A few months later I had a brief letter from Lorimer announcing the death of his wife. He asked me, and indeed urged me, not to return to England for her funeral, and he added that she would not be buried in consecrated ground. Of the details of her death he said nothing, and I have heard nothing to this day. That was 5 years ago, and from that time until this last winter I saw nothing of my brother. Our tastes were widely different. We drifted apart. During those 5 years I made great progress and a considerable sum of money. After my first academy success I never wanted commissions. I had sitters all the year round, and all the day while the light lasted. I worked very hard, and possibly a little too hard. Of my engagement with Lady Adela I will say nothing, except that it came about while I was painting her portrait, and that the engagement was broken off in consequence of the circumstances I am about to relate. It was then one day last winter that a letter was brought to me in my studio in Tite Street from my brother Lorimer. He complained slightly of his health, and said that his nerves had gone all wrong. He complained that there were some curious matters on which he wished to take advice, and that he had no one to whom he could speak on those subjects. He urged me to come down and to stay for some time. If there were no room in the farmhouse that suited me for my painting, he would have a studio built for me. This was put in his usual formal and business-like language, but there was a brief postscript. "For heaven's sake, come soon." The letter puzzled me. Lorimer, as I knew him, had always been a remarkably independent man, reserved, taking no one into his confidence, resenting interference. His manner towards me had been slightly patronizing, and his attitude towards my painting frankly contemptuous. This letter was of a man disturbed, seeking help, ready to make any concessions. As I have already said, I had been working far too hard, and wanted a rest. During the last year I had made 20 times the sum I had spent. There was no reason why I should not take a holiday. The country around my brother's place is very beautiful. If I did work there at all, I thought it might amuse me to draw portraits for a while, and to take up with my first love, landscape. There had never been any affection between Lorimer and myself, but neither had there been any quarrel. There was just the steady and unsentimental family tie. I wrote to him briefly that I would come on the following day, and I hoped he had, or could get, some shooting for me. I told him that I should do little or no work, and he need not bother about a studio for me. I added, "Your letter leaves me quite in the dark, and I can't make out what the deuce is the matter with you. Why don't you see the doctor if you're ill?" It was a tedious journey down. One gets off the main line onto an insignificant local branch. People on the platform stare at the stranger and know when he comes from London. In order to be certain where he is going, they read with great care and no sense of shame the labels on his luggage. There are frowsy little refreshment rooms, tended by frowsy old women, who could never at any period of their past have been barmaids, and you can never get anything that you want. If you turn in despair from these homes of the fly-blown bun and the doubtful milk to the platforms, you may amuse yourself by noting that the further one gets from civilization, the greater is the importance of the railway porter. Some of them quite resent being sworn at. I got out at the least important station on this unimportant line, and as I gave up my ticket, asked the man if Mr. Escort was waiting for me. "If," said the man slowly, "you mean Mr. Lorimer Escort, of the Dyke Farm, he is outside in his dog-cart." "What's the sense of talking like that, you fool?" I asked. "Have you got 20 different escorts about here?" "No," he replied gravely, "we have not, and I don't know that we want them." I explained to him that I was not interested in what he wanted or didn't want, and that he could go to the devil. He mumbled some angry reply as I went out of the station. Lorimer leant down from the dog-cart and shook hands with me impassively. He is a big man, with a stern, thin-lipped, clean-shaven face. I noted that his hair had gone very grey, though at his time he was not more than 36 years of age. He shouted a direction that my luggage was to come up in the farm cart that stood just behind, bid me rather impatiently to climb up, and brought his whip sharply across the mare's shoulder. There was no necessity to have touched her at all, and as she happened to be a good one, she resented it. Once outside the station yard, we went like the wind. So far as driving was concerned, his nerves seemed to me to be right enough. The road got worse and worse, and the cart jolted and swayed. "Steady, you idiot!" I shouted to him. "I don't want my neck broken." "All right," he said. He pulled the mare in, spoke to her, and quieted her. Then he turned to me. "If this makes you nervous," he said, I'd better turn round and drive you back. A man who is easily frightened wouldn't be of much use to me at Dyke Farm just now. When a man drives like a fool, I suppose it's always a consolation to call the man a funk who tells him so. You can go on to your farm, and I'll promise you one thing. When I am frightened, I will tell you." He became more civil at once. He said that was better. As for the driving, he had merely amused himself by trying to take a rise out of a Londoner. His house was 6 miles from the station, and for the rest of the way we chatted amicably enough. He told me that he was his own bailiff and his own housekeeper, managed the farm like a man and the house like a woman. He said that hard work suited him. "You must find it pretty lonely," I said. "I do," he answered. "Lately I've been wishing that I could find it still lonelier." "Look here," I said, "do you mind telling me plainly what on earth is the matter?" "You shall see for yourself," he said. The farmhouse had begun by being a couple of cottages, and 2 or 3 considerable additions had been made to it at different times. Consequently, the internal architecture was somewhat puzzling. The hall and 2 of the living rooms were fairly large, but the rooms upstairs were small and detestably arranged. Often one room opened into another, and sometimes into 2 or 3 others. The floor was of different heights, and one was always going up or down a step or 2. 3 staircases in different parts of the house led from the ground floor to the upper story. The old moss-grown tiles of the roof were pleasing, and the whole place was rather a picturesque jumble. But we only stopped in the house for the time of a whisky and soda. Lorimer took me around the garden almost immediately. It was a walled garden, and good only as an old garden can be. Lorimer was fond of it. His spirits seemed to improve, and at that moment I could find nothing abnormal in him. The farm cart with my luggage lumbered slowly up, and presently a gong inside the house rang loudly. "Ah," said Lorimer, pulling out his watch. "Time to dress. I'll show you your room, if you like." My room consisted really of 2 rooms, opening into one another. They seemed comfortable enough, and there were beautiful views from the windows of both of them. Lorimer left me, and I began in a leisurely way to dress for dinner. As I was dressing, I heard a queer little laugh, coming apparently from one of the upper rooms in the passage. I took little notice of it at first. I supposed it was due to one of the neat and rosy-cheeked maids who were busy about the house. Then I heard it again, and this time it puzzled me. I knew that laugh, knew it perfectly well, but could not place it. Then suddenly it came to me. It was exactly like the laugh of my sister-in-law, who had died in this house. It struck me as a queer coincidence. Naturally enough, I blundered on, coming downstairs, and first opened the door of the dining-room. I noticed that the table was laid for 3 people, and supposed that Lorimer had asked some neighbour to meet me, possibly a man over whose land I was to shoot. One of the maids directed me to the drawing-room, and I went in. At one end of the room a log fire flickered and hissed, and the smell of the wood was pleasant. The room was lit by 2 large ground-glass lamps, relics of my dead sister-in-law's execrable taste. I had at once the feeling that I was not alone in the room, and almost instantly a girl who had been kneeling on the rug in front of the fire got up and came towards me with hands outstretched. Her age seemed to be about 16 or 17. She had red hair, perhaps the most perfect red that I have ever seen. Her face was beautiful. Her eyes were large and grey, but there was something queer about those eyes. I noticed it immediately. She was dressed in the simplest manner in white. As she came towards me, she gave that little laugh which I had heard upstairs, and then I knew what was strange in her eyes. They also at moments did not look quite human. "You look surprised," she said. "Did not Mr. Estcourt tell you that I should be here? I am Linda, you know." Linda was the name of my dead sister-in-law. The name, the laugh, the eyes, all suggested that this was the daughter of Linda Estcourt. But this was a girl of 16 or 17, and my brother's marriage had taken place only 9 years before. Besides, she spoke of him as Mr. Estcourt. I was making some amiable and some more or less confused reply when Lorimer entered. "Ah," he said, "I see you have already made Miss Marston's acquaintance. I had hoped to be in time to introduce you." We began to chat about my journey down, the beauty of the country, all sorts of commonplace things. I was struck greatly by her air, at once mysterious and contemptuous. It irritated and yet it fascinated me. At dinner she said laughingly that it would really be rather confusing now. There would be 2 Mr. Estcourts, Mr. Lorimer Estcourt and Mr. Hubert Estcourt. She would have to think of some way of making a distinction. "I think," she said, turning to my brother, "I shall go on calling you Mr. Estcourt, and I shall call you Brother Hubert." I said that I should be greatly flattered, and her grey eyes showed me that I had no need to be. From this time onward she called me Hubert, as though she had known me and despised me all my life. I noticed that 2 or 3 times at dinner she seemed to fall into fits of abstraction, in which she was hardly conscious that one had spoken to her, and I noticed, moreover, that these fits of abstraction irritated my brother immensely. She rose at the end of dinner, and said she would see if the billiard-room was lit up. We could come and smoke in there as soon as we liked. I gave a sigh of relief as I closed the door behind her. "At last," I said. "Now then, Lorimer, perhaps you will tell me who this Miss Marston is." "Tell me who you think she is." "No, don't." "She is my dead wife's younger sister, younger by many years. Her father took the name of Marston shortly before his death. I am her guardian. My wife's dying words were occupied entirely with this sister, about whom she told me much that would seem to you strange beyond belief, and at the same time she gave me injunctions, wrested promises from me which under certain conditions I shall have to carry out. The conditions may arise. I think they will. I don't mind saying that I'm afraid they will." "Why does she bear her sister's name? Why does she address you as Mr. Estcourt? And why do you address her as Miss Marston, when she introduces herself to me simply as Linda?" "Her mother had 3 daughters. The eldest was called Linda. When she died, the second, who was my wife, took that name. When my wife died, the name descended to the 3rd of them. There has always been a Linda in the family. The rest is simply Miss Marston's own whim. She has several." "Who chaperones her here?" I asked. He smiled. "That question is typical of you. She is little more than a child, and she is an almost excessively respectable governess living here to look after her. Only I can't be bothered with the governess at dinner quite every night. Does that satisfy you?" "No. Well, perhaps yes. I suppose so." "It may make your rigid mind a little easier if I tell you, and it is the truth, that if I had my own way I would turn Miss Marston out of this house tomorrow, and that I would never set eyes on her again. That I have a horror of her, and she has a contempt of me. And of most other people, I fancy. Well, anyhow, what's the trouble?" "I haven't the time to tell you a long story now. She will be waiting for us. Besides, you would merely laugh at me. You have not yet seen for yourself." What would you say if I told you of a compact made years and years ago with some power of evil, and that this girl was concerned in the fulfillment of it? What should I say? Very little. I should get a couple of doctors to sign you up at once. Naturally, you would think me mad. Well, wait here for a few weeks and see what you make of things. In the meantime, come along to the billiard room. The billiard room was an addition that Lorimer himself had made to the house. We found Linda crouched on the rug in front of the blazing fire. I soon found out that this was a favourite attitude with her. Her coffee cup was balanced on her knees. Her eyes stared into the flames. She did not seem to notice our entrance. "Miss Marston," said my brother. There was a shade of annoyance in his voice. She looked up at him with a disdainful smile. "Do you care to give Hubert a game?" he asked. "Not yet. I want to watch a game first. You two play, and I'll mark." "What am I to give you, Lorimer?" I asked. 30? He was not even a moderate player. I had always been able to give him at least that. "You had better play even," said Linda, "and I think you will be beaten, Hubert." I looked at Lorimer in astonishment. "Very well, Miss Marston," he said, as he took down his cue. I could only suppose that during the last few years his play had improved considerably, and even then I did not see why Linda had interfered. How on earth could she know what my game was like? "This is your evening," I said to Lorimer after his first outrageous fluke. "It would seem so," he answered, and fluked again. And this went on. His game had not improved. He did the wrong things and did them badly, and they turned out all right. Now and again I heard Linda's brief laugh. I looked up at her. Her eyes seemed to have power to coax a lagging ball into a pocket. One had a curious feeling that she was controlling the game. I did my best with all the luck dead against me. It was a close finish, but I was beaten, as Linda said I should be. Linda would not play. She said she was tired, and suddenly she looked tired. The light went out of her eyes. She lit a cigarette and went back to her place on the rug before the fire. Lorimer talked about his farm with me. The quiet of the place seemed almost ghastly to a man who was used to London. Presently Linda got up to go to bed. "Good night, Mr. Escort," she said, as she shook hands with my brother. Then she turned to me. "Good night, Hubert. You shouldn't quarrel with ticket collectors about nothing. It's silly, isn't it?" She kissed me on the cheek and ran off laughing. She left me astounded by her words and insulted by her kiss. Lorimer turned out the lights over the billiard table, and we sat down again by the fire. "What did you think of that game?" he asked. "It was remarkable." "Nothing more?" "I never saw a game like it before. But there was nothing impossible about it." "Very well. And did you have a row with that ticket collector?" "Not a row, exactly. He annoyed me, and I may have called him a fool. I suspect you overheard and told her about it." "I could not have overheard. I was outside the station buildings, and you were on the further platform." "Yes, that's true. It's a queer coincidence." "I tried that too at first, the belief that things were remarkable, but not impossible, and that queer coincidences happen. Personally, I can't keep it up any more." "Look here," I said, "we may as well go to the point at once. Why do you want me here? Why did you send for me?" "Suppose that I said I wanted you to marry Miss Marston?" "I thought that at the time of my engagement with Delia I wrote and gave you the news." "You did. The artistic temperament does sometimes do a brilliant business thing for itself. Lady Delia marries—" "We won't discuss her." "Then suppose we discuss you. You are half in love with Linda already." "Very well," I said, "let us carry the supposition a little further. Suppose that I, or anybody else, was entirely in love with her. What on earth would be the use? The one thing that one could feel absolutely certain about in her is that she has an amused contempt for the rest of her species, male and female. It's not affected, it's perfectly genuine. Even if I wished to marry her, she would not look at me." "Really?" said Lorimer, with a sneer. "She seemed fond enough of you when she gave you good night." "That," I said meditatively, "was the cleverest kiss that ever was kissed. It finished what the interchange of Christian names began. It settled the situation exactly, that I was the fool of a brother, and she the good-natured, though contemptuous sister. You needn't look at it like that. It is important, exceedingly important, that she should be married." "Marry her yourself. It won't be legal in this country, but it will be in others, and I don't know that it matters." "No, I don't know that it matters. On the day I wrote to you, I did ask her to be my wife. She replied that it was disagreeable to have to speak of such things, and that they need not be allowed to come to the surface again, but that, as a matter of fact, au fond, we hated each other. It was true. I do hate her. What I do for her is for my dead wife's sake, for the promises I made, and perhaps a little for common humanity. There are others who would marry her. The man whose pheasants you will be shooting next week would give his soul for her cheerfully. And it's no use. Very likely it will be of no use in your case." "What was the story that you had not time to tell me after dinner?" The door opened, and a servant brought in the decanters and soda water, and arranged them on the table by Lorimer's side. He did not speak until the servant had gone out of the room, and then he seemed to be talking almost more to himself than to me. "At night, when one wakes up in the small hours, after a bad dream or hearing some sudden noise in the house, one believes things of which one is a little ashamed next morning." He paused, and then leant forward, addressing me directly. "Look here, I'll say it in a few words. You won't believe it, and that doesn't matter a tinker's curse to me. You'll believe it a little later if you stop here. Generations ago, in the time of witches, a woman who was to have been burned as a witch escaped miraculously from the hands of the officers. It was said that she had a compact with the devil, and that some future time he should take a living maiden of her line. Death and marriage are the two ways of safety for any woman of that family. The compact has not yet been carried out, and Linda is the last of the line. She bears the signs of which my wife told me. One by one I watch them coming out in her. Her power over inanimate objects, her mysterious knowledge of things which have happened elsewhere, the terror of which all animals have of her. A year or two ago she was always about the farm on the best of terms with every dog and horse in the place. Now they will not let her come near them. Well, it is my business to save Linda. I have given my promise. I wish her to be married. If that is not possible, and the moment arrives, I must kill her." "Why talk like a fool?" I said. "Come and live in London for a week. It strikes me that both Linda and yourself might perhaps be benefited by being put into the hands of a specialist." In any case, don't tell these fairy stories to a sane man like myself." "Very well," he said, getting up. "I must be going to bed. I am out on the farm before 6 every morning, and I shall probably have breakfasted before you are up. Miss Marston and Mrs. Denison, that's her old governess, breakfast at 9. You can join them if you like, or breakfast by yourself later." Long after my brother had gone to bed, I sat in the billiard room, thinking the thing over, angry with myself, and indeed ashamed that I could not disbelieve quite as certainly as I wished. At breakfast next morning, I asked Linda to sit to me for her portrait, and she consented. We found a room with a good light. Mrs. Denison remained with us during the sitting. This went on for days. The portrait was a failure. I have the best of the several attempts that I made still. The painting's all right, but the likeness is not there. There is something missing in the eyes. I saw a great deal of Linda, and I came at last to this conclusion, that I had no explanation whatever of the powers which she undoubtedly possessed. I also learned that she herself was well acquainted with the story of her house. She alluded to the fact that neither of her sisters was buried in consecrated ground. No woman of her family would ever be. "And you?" I asked. "I am not sure that I shall be buried at all. To me strange things will happen." I had letters occasionally from Lady Adela. I was glad to see that she was getting tired of the whole thing. My conduct had not been so calculating and ignoble as Lorimer had supposed. She was a very beautiful woman. It was easy enough to suppose that one was in love with her, until one happened to fall in love. I determined to go to London to see Lady Adela, and to give her the chance, which I was sure she wanted, to throw me over. I promised Lorimer that I would only be away for one night. Lady Adela missed her appointment with me at her mother's house, and left a note of excuse. Something serious had happened, I believe, with regard to a dress that she was to wear that night. But really, I do not remember what her excuse was. I went back to my rooms in Tite Street, and there I found a telegram from Mrs. Denison. It told me in plain language, and with due regard to the fact that each word cost a halfpenny, that my brother, in a fit of madness, had murdered Linda Marston and taken his own life. I got back to my brother's farm late that night. The evidence at the inquest was simple enough. Linda had 3 rooms, opening into one another, the one furthest from the passage being her bedroom. At the time of the murder, Mrs. Denison was in the 2nd room, reading, and Linda was playing the piano in the room which opened into the passage. Mrs. Denison heard the music stop suddenly. Linda was whimsical in her playing, as in everything else. There was a pause, during which the governess was absorbed in her book. Then she heard in the next room Lorimer say distinctly, "It is all right, Linda. I have come to save you." This was followed by 3 shots in succession. Mrs. Denison rushed in and found the 2 lying dead. She was greatly affected at the inquest, and as few questions as possible were put to her. Some time afterwards, Mrs. Denison told me a thing which she did not mention at the inquest. Shortly after the music had stopped, and before Lorimer entered the room, she had heard another voice, as though someone were speaking with Linda. This third voice, and Linda's own, were in low tones, and no words could be heard. I thought this over, and I remembered that Lorimer fired 3 times, and that the third bullet was found in another part of the room. Lady Adela was certainly quite right to give me up, which she did in a most tactful and sympathetic letter. End of chapter. Recording by Barney Hallowell, Cambridge, October 2017.